Oh, good afternoon. Thank you for your interest in the Adventist Health Study, and I'm delighted to once again have an opportunity to provide an update on our work using AHS2 data. As many of you will be aware, this is actually the culmination of nearly 60 years of a mainly externally funded research studying the health experience of Adventists. Despite that, much more remains to be done. And I know that many of you who are watching are participants in this study, and we're very grateful for your efforts in helping bring it to fruition. In terms of gathering new data, this study is now completed, but much analysis and writing remains, and work is underway also to plan a new cohort that will combine Adventists and non-Adventists, and also will find and demonstrate cost-effective ways we hope to establish a large biorepository of blood and perhaps urine. Many of you will be aware that AHS2 is primarily a study of relating nutrition to health. And we recognize that there are other important factors, but nutrition has always been our focus. It is often said that we are what we eat, and that sounds rather trite, but a little reflection will probably indicate that, in fact, this must be true. Hence, it would not be surprising if what we put inside our bodies would be surprising and did not have a measurable effect on just what happens to these chemical factories. Nutritional epidemiology is a very challenging field, as long-term randomized intervention trials are rarely possible when chronic diseases are the end point of interest and diet is the intervention. They're very expensive, and to go on for years is just not possible. Rather, we must settle for what we call observational studies like AHS2, where people live their lives as they will, but it is the goal that with the appropriate experimental design and statistical adjustment to approximate the results as if a randomized trial had indeed been conducted. In AHS2, we've given a great deal of attention to these design and analytic features, and it's actually one of the strongest methodologic studies that are available. There are, of course, hundreds of foods and thousands of phytochemicals that are potentially involved with these questions in our diet, and that just adds to the complications of this kind of work. So let's see what we are finding. And I've chosen as an update to mainly present our results since 2015, with a couple of exceptions. We have had a considerable focus in AHS2 as compared to AHS1 on vegetarian diets and different sorts of vegetarians. Also, we've now investigated a few particular food groups that are either prominent or prominently missing in these diets. And this is because there's a lot of interest in vegetarianism, more in Europe actually than the US. And this is both from the perspective of personal health and also planetary health. And because AHS2 is one of those very few studies that can authoritatively address many of these questions. So let's move ahead with some slides here. First of all, to talk about vegetarian dietary patterns, some definitions and some lifetime dynamics. In AHS2, we talked about vegans, who were about 9% of the population. Most of our vegetarians were lacto-ovo. That means they had dairy and eggs, about 30%. And then smaller numbers of pesco-vegetarians who also ate some fish but no other meats, semi-vegetarians who ate meats but less than once a week, and non-vegetarians who ate meats, not only fish, more than once a week or once a week. And this slide is just to point out that we did find big differences in the intake of different foods in these different dietary patterns. This line here represents the non-vegetarians. these different colors, the green is the vegans, the yellow, the lactose, and the blue is the pescos, and the red is the semi-vegetarians. And you can see for these foods here, which are all vegetable and fruit kind of foods, that the vegetarians all hang to the right of the non-vegetarians, who are this line down the middle. Whereas when we turn to the animal foods, then the vegetarians, which are these colored bars, all hang far to the left in general for most of these foods. And these are not only animal foods, but they're foods that are actually usually considered nutritionally less desirable. So you can see that we were able to separate the population into some interestingly differing diets. We also have published that over the course of the lifetime, people change their diets in different ways and interesting ways. For instance, we found that the people, most of whom when they were younger in their 20s and 30s, very few were vegans. As they got older, they tended to change to become vegan. There tended to be also a similar change, more were becoming lacto-ovos. Not so much change in the pescos and the semis, but seeing more of the vegetarians were represented in the older age groups. Of course, it had to be that those that started off as non-vegetarians were coming less and less. They were turning to become more vegetarian Adventists as they got older. So I'd like to start, and first of all, talking about total mortality. And like I said, this is just an update. It's in no way a reflection of everything we've published. This is an interesting paper, I think, that we published a couple of years ago. The first time that we were able, using national data, to compare mortality rates with Adventists compared to a census population of the American population, a census American population. And it was new in another respect, and that it was the first time we had been able to look separately at Black Adventists. And so we can see here that if we call the census population's rates of these various causes of death the 1.0, that's the census population. Here are the results for the Adventists that all hang at lower values. You can see that when we come to looking at all-cause mortality around the age of 65, there's about a 1/3 reduction in the Adventists. Less of a reduction by the time you get to 85, but still about 20%. And in the Blacks, we're finding the same kind of situation, about a 35% reduction, highly significant. These are the 95% intervals. So they're far, far away from ever encompassing a 1, which would mean no difference. When we look at cancer mortality, less of a difference, but still pretty significant, and high, only 10% in absolute terms, but unlikely to be due to chance. In the Blacks, slightly higher values, higher or wider confidence interval because of smaller numbers, of course. And when we look at other causes of death, they, of course, had to be relatively low because it's a mix of this plus that equals that. So for other causes of death, which would include cardiovascular, we see the Adventists in general are hanging quite far below the non-Adventist reference. And that's true in the Blacks as well, about a 42% reduction in the Black Adventists, which is interesting, I think. We then have published, or actually trying to publish at the moment, a paper, the first time we're able to look at the possibility of different types of Adventist. And we're looking here at the level of processing of dietary items and different types, actually not only Adventists, but different types of vegetarians. And we've wondered about that for a long time. And this is what we did, and Dr. Orlich, Michael Orlich and Dr. Sabate have taken the lead on this. We took a whole bunch of food groups, about 30 of them, and divided these foods into minimally processed, moderately, and highly processed. And what we were able to show was interesting. And this is how I've just taken a few examples here of what we mean by that. The minimally processed fruits, for instance, were fresh fruits. moderately processed if they were canned or cooked or dried, and highly processed were the jams with a lot of sugar and so forth. The vegetables, raw vegetables, cooked vegetables. Here we have canned, juiced soups. And here we have where fats are added and so forth, and particularly potatoes. When we turn to grains, these are relatively raw grains, unprocessed. Here they have been stripped of the husk and the white rice, not so for the whole grains. And here we have highly processed grains. For the meat analogues, we found, or they judged that none were minimally processed, but these were less processed as compared to all of the others. When we looked at dairy, we thought that milk was a minimally processed food as it came out of the cow. These, including most of the cheeses, or many of the cheeses, are moderately processed, and some of these, including American processed and cheddar cheese, were highly processed. The meats also were unprocessed in general, but as we know, there are processed meat products, and we put a number of them in here. And then those that were more highly processed, kind of sausages and so forth, went into that highly processed category. So, and then we had a whole bunch of others as well, which I won't go through. But here's what we found, and it was really quite interesting. If you look here, where these are comparisons, highly processed versus any processing, high versus medium. And the facts are that any time our category of interest is highly processed, we find that these bars here, which represent risk of dying, this is mortality, and this is no difference between, say, high and any processing or high and medium. In fact, the high diets that had a lot of highly processed foods had, in this case, about a 23% increased risk, and particularly if we're comparing high versus low processed diets, about a 24% increase in risk. And notice that these confidence intervals do not come close to including the no effect category. So something is going on here. And if we looked only at the vegetarians, we find a very similar kind of situation. Anytime high is our interest category, these bars hang far above the 1.0 line. And if so, this tells us that there are different kinds of vegetarians. The vegetarians who have a lot of high processed foods are going to have a higher risk, and perhaps not so different to non-vegetarians. And if we look at the non-vegetarians, we see that there will be certain non-vegetarians who have small amounts of high processed foods that may have, in fact, a relatively lower risk. And this, by the way, is adjusting for percent of energy from animal foods and a whole bunch of other covariates. So it's a highly adjusted analysis trying to specifically focus on processing of the foods. Now, if we kind of turn the coin over and say, well, let's have a look at the different animal foods, but this time adjusting for processing. I mean, is vegetarian status just an indicator of less processed foods? Is that what's going on? Is that all that's going on? And in fact, when we try and relate poultry and fish and dairy and even the totality of animal foods to mortality risk, after we adjust for processing, we don't find any signal of increased mortality. However, if we look at red meats, and in this population, that was a very modest amount of the total animal foods. The Adventists tended not to eat a lot of red meats. There we found a pretty clear signal. And it would have been surprising if we had not done that. So that's kind of interesting and puts just a little extra twist on the way we think of these things. Let's turn now to cardiovascular disease. And these are old slides. And just to talk for a moment about risk factors for CVD, and I won't dwell long on these, many of you will have seen them before. We know as we pass from vegans to lactose to pescos to semi-vegetarians to non-vegetarians, that body weight goes up like a step ladder. These are for the woman and these are for men of average height, the body weight. If we look at those, the frequency of being currently treated for high blood pressure, we find that same progression across the vegetarian to the non-vegetarian reference category. Similarly, with diabetes, the vegetarians are at much lower risk, and also those that are currently treated for high blood cholesterol, the same kind of thing. And we've dug into this much deeper and find that these really are a fair representation, it seems, of what's going on. And more recently, we have published on C-reactive protein, which many of you will recognize as an indicator of inflammation in the body. And again, find this similar kind of progression. And all of these bars, the height of them is significantly lower than for the non-vegetarians. We haven't published this yet. Let me move my picture out of the way. Here you can see that mean fasting insulin is also not so different amongst the vegetarian categories, perhaps a little lower here, but distinctly higher in the non-vegetarians, and this is unlikely to be due to chance. I just show this for comparison, and some of you who are perhaps African-American or West Indian in the audience will be interested, that are expressed in a different way, but we find essentially the same things amongst our Black HS2 participants, that if we give the score of 1.0 to the non-vegetarians, then the combination of other vegetarians and vegans had nearly only half as much hypertension, half as much diabetes, high cholesterol, much less obesity in the woman and the men, although it wasn't quite significant in the men, and less abdominal adiposity. So what we're finding in the total subjects in AHS2 is pretty well mirrored in the Black subjects as well, which is interesting. Turning now to actual heart attack and fatal heart disease. This is also an old slide just to set the scene. We compared our Adventists in California to a concurrent study of non-Adventists that was going on in North California, and using the same definitions exactly of fatal heart disease. And we found at different ages, if we gave the non-Adventists a score of 1.0, here was the experience of Adventists dying from heart disease. And you can see as they got older, the advantage was less, but it was still very, very important and significant. And I'm not showing you, but the vegetarians did better even than the total of Adventists in this graph. So more recently, we have published a paper which took a slightly different perspective on diet. Everyone knows that saturated fats and trans fatty acids are not good for cardiovascular disease. But how about proteins? And there is a lot of interest in that. And so we decided to let's have a look at proteins that came from different categories of food items and adjust out the effects of dietary fat so that we're able to look at proteins alone. And we adjusted for a whole lot of other things as well. And again, we split it by age. And we found that if we looked at proteins from meat, adjusting for the effect of fats in meat, remember, that as those levels of proteins got higher and higher and higher, these are the quintiles of intake over here, you can see that particularly at the higher quintiles, the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease went up in these young people, and this is despite having very few events. At a little older ages, we still found the signal. Interestingly, as we got to the old and the very old, that signal started to disappear. And then we looked at proteins from another food category, nuts. And we found kind of the inverse trend, that as you ate more and more nuts at the younger age groups, it really made a big difference, lower risk. Middle age, same kind of thing. But again, the signal tended to die out at older ages. So it almost looks like the impact of some of these dietary factors for cardiovascular disease may be rather less in the very elderly, which puts extra emphasis on eating right when you're young and in your middle years. But I hasten to add that for total mortality and for cancer mortality, this age dependency doesn't always hold. So it's still worth being careful with your diet, even to older years. Now I'd like to turn to look at some common cancers. And the commonest cancers, of course, are prostate, breast, and colorectal in our population. And I'm now turning back. Remember that comparison that we published comparing Adventists to a US Census population. So these are two national populations now, one Adventist, one all Americans. And if we look at all cancers, you can see this, remember, this is the census population level, that the advantage in cancer for the Adventists is about 30%. And look at the error bars. They're virtually non-existent. So this is a very accurate result, hugely unlikely to be due to chance. Amongst the blacks, almost identical results. A little bit less, but the error bars are wider because there are fewer deaths. If we look at breast cancer, and this time, by the way, we're not talking about deaths as we were before. This is all cancers. Breast cancers, those who lived and those who died. And when we do that, we see big advantages for the Adventists pretty clearly for breast cancer, probably for blacks, but again, we can have less certainty because of smaller numbers. For prostate, not too clear, but it looks like we may have some advantage there. Sorry, my computer has thrown me out. Let me just take a moment. Should be able to get back to where I was very quickly. Yeah. So, and going down the list, you can see in general these bars tend to hang to the left of the line. So it turns out that looking at cancer, it's a tough thing to explore because each cancer is relatively rare and uncommon, and to get enough of them to narrow down those error bars is quite a challenge. But colorectal cancer looks like we also do pretty well. And lung cancer, of course, that largely relates to smoking, but probably also fruit consumption. So there are big advantages for cancer as well, it seems, to being Adventist, which doesn't necessarily answer the question of what is it about being Adventist that makes the difference. And we'll get on to that a little later. So I'd like to be a little bit more specific now and show you some more detailed results with respect to these three relatively common cancers. These are all published now. You can see here that this is a little bit complicated. It's the probability of surviving free of colon cancer, adjusting for a whole bunch of other covariates, of course, and comparing vegetarians to non-vegetarians. And these are all Adventists now. This whole slide, everything I talk about, these are all Adventists of different sorts. So this is the experience of vegetarian Adventists. And in fact, they've got about a 20% lower rate and therefore a higher chance of surviving free of colon cancer at every age along here, as compared to the non-vegetarian Adventists who have a lower chance at any age of surviving free of colon cancer. An identical kind of graph, this time for breast cancer, but splitting out the various vegetarian categories. Our comparison point, the non-vegetarians, is red here. And you can see that the lacto-ovos, the yellow, and the pescos, and the semis don't differ dramatically from the non-vegetarians with respect to breast cancer. But the group that does look like it's different are the vegans. They seem to be surviving free of breast cancer to a greater extent, even though it did not quite reach statistical significance with the numbers we had. Turning to prostate cancer, looking at it in a slightly different way, you can see that, again, our reference is the non-vegetarians, blue here. For the pesco-vegetarians, really no difference. For the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, really no difference. But again, it's the vegans that had about a 34% reduction, and this was highly unlikely to be due to chance. So to summarize, the colorectal vegetarians had lower risk of colorectal cancer. Amongst the vegans, they did better for both breast cancer and prostate cancer, but for those two cancers, the other vegetarians really didn't have significant advantage. So now I want to turn to a few specific foods, selected specific foods. And you're probably well aware that it's now clearly advised by many august bodies that processed meat and probably red meat as a whole is to be avoided or minimized with respect to colorectal cancer risk. This is unpublished data from Adventist Health Study. And we find that even though very, very few of our people ate significant processed meat, see 50 grams a day is about one sausage. And we had very few out here. But if we have a look at this, we do get a significant result because of the small numbers, very wide confidence intervals. The fine interrupted line is the 95% confidence interval. But this heavier interrupted line is actually what the World Health Organization published as the risk of processed food consumption. One sausage a day, about an 18% increase in risk. Our data suggests it's more like a 65% increase in risk, although the confidence interval is very wide, but even our low bound is somewhat higher than the average that was found in a composite of other studies. So that's interesting. If we now look at dairy, and I'm going to have a little focus on dairy in the next few minutes coming up, because it's a very interesting food to look at, and you'll immediately recognize that one of the main distinctions between vegans and the other vegetarians, and also most of the non-vegetarians, is the lack of dairy in vegans. So if we now look at colorectal cancer as a group, and we compare the zeros, because we had a lot of zeros in this population, of course, not only vegans, but some of the non-vegetarians were not consumers of dairy, but then compare that to the high intakes, which is 1.5 to 2 cups of milk a day, for instance, but we're including cheese here. No, this is milk, so that's correct. And we see that those who are consuming more milk had about a 35% reduction in risk of colorectal cancer. And you might be surprised at that. If we just look at colon cancer alone, it's about a 33% reduction, and this is statistically significant, just. And then we wondered, well, maybe this is related to the calcium intake, because there'd been a little discussion about that in the literature. And when we looked at the calcium signal for colorectal cancer, it was kind of suggestive, but it didn't quite meet significance. But if we focused on colon cancer alone, we found indeed that it appeared that it probably was the calcium, because here we had adjusted for dairy, and we're looking at the combination of calcium from dairy and calcium from other sources, and found that that signal remained even after adjusting for other aspects of dairy. And by the way, not so much the calcium thing, but the whole idea of dairy being protective for colorectal cancer is not unique to us. It's been found by other studies, also good studies, although it's not generally accepted, but I think it's highly probable that this is the case. I'd like to think now about dairy and breast cancer. And we were very interested in looking at breast cancer from a perspective of soy, of course. because a lot of our population eat and drink much soy. But we recognized, of course, that we had to adjust for dairy, because if we didn't do that, soy consumption could just be a marker for the absence of dairy consumption. And we really wanted to tease those two things apart. So here we chose to measure intake of soy as isoflavones, and we adjusted for dairy kcals here and many, many other things, looking at breast cancer as our outcome, and really didn't find much signal. Nothing much that met statistical significance. These are the p-values over here. And so that was interesting. And then again, we decided to turn the coin over and look at the effect directly of dairy. And so we, this time, of course, adjusted for soy isoflavones and for calcium and for a bunch of other things. And indeed, we found a signal. And we might have maybe guessed at this because the vegans were doing so much better, remember, when we looked at the dietary patterns in breast cancer. We found about a 24% increase when we looked at total dairy, including cheese and yogurt and a few other things. But if we focused on dairy milk, we seemed to find the best signal, and this was highly unlikely to be due to chance. And in fact, when we looked specifically at cheese and yogurt, we didn't find much going on there. And so that's interesting. And we wondered about, for both prostate and for breast cancer, whether IGF-1 would be the active principle here, because animal proteins are known to raise that chemical. It's kind of a hormone, tissue hormone in the blood. And it's also been shown that that is a risk factor for dairy and breast cancer. We also used our analysis to ask a question. What say we took someone who is used to drinking half a cup, which was about the average per day of soy milk amongst the users, and said, okay, let's pretend that they changed and made that dairy milk instead. And we could do that with our statistical models, and we found that we would predict, if they did that, that their risk of breast cancer would drop by 30 to 40%, and that was highly significant, statistically significant. If we want to graph this out, and this is on a log scale here, so you can see that even out here, we're only a quarter of a cup, half a cup, 1 cup. And at this point, we're out to a relative risk of about 1.5 or a little higher. And if we took a non-log scale, this would actually rise very quickly and then tend to flatten out somewhat. And that's exactly what we're showing. And so it interestingly tends to indicate that milk, adjusting for soy and all these other things, appears to be a strong risk factor in our population for breast cancer, which is a relatively new and somewhat controversial finding. But we looked at it in many ways. We used splines, we used calibrated regressions, and it was always there. We couldn't make that signal go away. Whatever we adjusted for, a whole bunch of reproductive factors and other dietary factors, there it still was. Turning now to prostate cancer, the third of these common cancers, and looking at some relative risk kind of numbers here, and focusing again on dairy and calcium. When we look at, here is all prostate cancers in this column, and then we divide them to advanced and non-advanced. But for all prostate cancers, when we look at calcium and adjusting for dairy, we found really nothing significant going on. When we looked at dairy calcium, however, put the dairy in there, suddenly everything sprang to life. We had a highly significant result. Indeed, when we looked at total dairy, that didn't focus on the calcium anymore necessarily. We couldn't really distinguish the components of dairy, which might be important. We again found a pretty large increase, and these are highly significant. They're not likely to be due to chance. When we look at the advanced cases, they're only about 15 to 20% of the total, so we were struggling with lower numbers. But again, we got a sense that the risks were higher, even though they weren't always statistically significant because of the low numbers. And once again, if we look in the non-advanced cases, we see things spring to life a little here, not too much, probably a chance result, but it really happens when you put dairy in the equation for those as well. So that's interesting. And we focused a little bit on black subjects because many of you will know that blacks have about a double risk of prostate cancer. And so we were particularly interested in those, and I won't spend a lot of time, but you can see the same pattern, not much going on here, springs to life when we put dairy in the equation. We had not enough advanced cases to look at, but in the non-advanced, throwing out the small number of advanced cases, we found almost identical, in fact, pretty strong, very strong patterns. And if we graph this time it's not on a log scale, so you can see that here we're only at about 3/4 of a cup a day that we're also already seeing as compared to 0, which is down here, a huge, that 60% increase in risk is largely there by a cup a day, which is an interesting biological observation. So now I want to turn in the last cluster of things I wanted to talk about this morning to diet and molecules and mechanisms, because nutritional epidemiology is often criticized for just being a study of correlations. And in a way it is. And therefore we need to bolster our evidence in as many ways as we can to start talking about causality. We have so far, and we're just beginning this work, looked at DNA methylation and metabolomics. And so what is all this about? DNA methylation, as some of you will know, many of you, DNA, if it's methylated, it changes the activity. So this is an epigenetic type of mechanism, and we'll explore that in a moment. It turns out that most of the databases that we can easily obtain, actually high cost, we can get data on, we got it on about 350,000 different sites where DNA can be methylated. Now you can do much better than that, about 850,000. So this means that for every person, and we could only afford it in a couple of hundred people, we had 300,000 data points. So think about how you might go about analyzing that. It's a whole new branch of statistics, which we've immersed ourselves in. I think we're doing pretty well at handling that. Then there's the metabolome. Those of us who are physicians are used to ordering tests from sheets that may have 40 or 50 different choices of things we can order in the blood. In fact, of course, there are thousands and thousands of chemicals in the blood, and we now have various platforms that we can order whole swaths of analyses on the blood in this way. And then there's the microbiome, which we've not got into in a major way yet, that relates to the large number of bacterial species that are particularly in our bowel. So here's what we have gotten ourselves into so far with DNA methylation, about 150 people that we were able to analyze. And I'm sorry, my picture might be obscuring for you. So what we found here, the analytic method that we used, which of course had to take very careful account of the fact that there's huge multiple testing going on here. For those of you who are statisticians, we took account of that. We could demonstrate that there's about 1,000 of the 1,800 genes that we had data on, because we could accumulate these DNA methylation sites to those that hung together on one gene. And as you know, there are about 21,000 genes the human has. We had data on about 18,600. And there was about 1,000 of those that we could show that the DNA methylation patterns in those genes, those 1,000 genes, were different in vegans as compared to non-vegetarian Adventists. And we can look at different places along those genes. And I won't take time to go into a lot of detail here. But one other thing we discovered that was a little chagrining was that with 150 people, we had really quite low power. We could only detect about 18 of these 1,000 that we knew were out there as different between the vegans and non-vegetarians. We could only specifically identify which ones these were, and about 18 of them that were particularly strongly different between these two dietary patterns. But we know now with larger numbers, and we can predict that we'll find more and be able to identify more and more of these 1,000. So it turned out that in vegans, the majority of these differentially methylated genes were relatively hypomethylated, less methylated, which is typically associated with increased gene expression. And this is perhaps explained in part by the inhibition of an enzyme called DNA methyltransferase, which has to do with transferring these methyl donors onto the DNA. And it turns out the polyphenols in the diet do have an inhibitory effect on that, which might explain why the vegans, who tend to have quite a lot of polyphenols in their diet from vegetables particularly, may have less DNA methylation. And it looked like about in different places, 6 to 9% of the genes were differentially methylated between these two dietary patterns. And of those that we detected, which remember there was only about 18, it was interesting. They assorted themselves pretty clearly into things that had to do with protein synthesis and also disassembly, the degradation of proteins, RNA transport, lysosome assembly, which is degrading, also degrades viruses, by the way, and B-cell receptor signaling. So remember, it increases the activity of these genes. And also with cellular control, which is relevant to cancer. And some of the genes we identified were a tumor suppressor gene and DNA repair. Remember, it increases the activity, the hypomethylation in the vegans. So that's interesting, isn't it? A lot more work to be done. We then turn to the metabolome, and we've done some work with metabolomics. And this is just to show you that these are the top few that seem to be differentially expressed, different levels in the blood of these metabolites. And we had data on about 930 different metabolites. And interestingly, we found, even with only 100 people, that we could detect 400 of those that were differentially expressed between the vegans and the non-vegetarians. To simplify things, we were able to accumulate these into subclasses. And there were about 100 different subclasses that we looked at that each on average then had, about 9 or 10 different metabolites, although that varied. And what we found is that the top increases in the vegans had to do with vitamin A metabolism, inositol, which is a vitamin-like substance, primary bile acids and ketone bodies. And the top decreases in the vegans is xanthine metabolism, which is probably mainly caffeine and coffee consumption, ceramides, which are found in a wide variety of foods, sometimes used as in skin products, histidine metabolism, and branch fatty acid metabolism. No surprise, a lot of that comes from dairy and some from beef, which we'd expect to be low in the vegans. So we found some interesting stuff. And in the future, of course, we need to think about relating methylation to the metabolome, methylation to the microbiome to methylation, all these things, and the transcriptome here. So let me start to wrap this up. Time is at that point. So what is the essence of all this? Well, first of all, Adventists are doing better than others. And that's not a new finding, but we just get more and more evidence. Among the Adventists, it's becoming absolutely clear that it's the vegetarians who are doing best. Not all Adventists are looking for that result, but it seems to be unassailable at this moment. Even though on average the non-vegetarian Adventists that we studied ate relatively little red meat and were actually quite health conscious. Now we are finding biological signals, as we've just seen in the DNA and amongst a wide range of metabolites, showing that the cells of vegans at least are bathed in fluids that are really quite different, which is interesting. Thus, this nutritional information has biological and a potential mechanistic base, although much more work needs to be done. So what is it in a vegetarian diet that makes a difference? Lack of red meat, lack of dairy, extra nuts, we've shown that. Possibly the wide variety of plant polyphenols. We just talked about that with respect to DNA methylation in vegans at least. Fewer highly processed foods. That's a newer finding in many vegetarian diets. And probably much more yet to be discovered. Do vegans do better than other vegetarians? I hesitate to go here, but let's try. Overall, from our data, the answer is no, if you're willing to look at total mortality, which some will say is only part of the picture, and it probably is. Morbidity is important. Vegans do have less cardiovascular disease, less cancer of the breast and prostate, but not quite so good for colorectal cancer. Still doing a lot better than non-vegetarians, by the way. And this could relate to calcium consumption, as we saw. And they possibly have more hemorrhagic stroke. This is not from HS2 data. We haven't looked at that, but from a study out of Oxford. Also for dementia, it's not totally clear. We haven't done enough work on that yet. Of the various vegetarian patterns, interestingly, it's the pesco vegetarians that actually have the lowest mortality, although it's unclear yet whether this is due to the fish. So what's a sensible person to do, in my opinion? It's clear that a vegetarian diet is to be preferred. Little argument about that anymore. It seems that we would be well to restrict highly processed foods. Be sure to get small, regular quantities of nuts in your diet. Our data would suggest that you would be wise to minimize the dairy, but with respect to colorectal cancer, be sure to get plenty of calcium, not too much, but plenty, and you can get that from plant sources. The occasional fish, if desired. Over the age of 60 years, it's good to supplement with vitamin B12, and by the way, our people do that quite well. Also ensure that you get adequate protein. It can be plant or animal. We've shown that and published this for bones. I didn't highlight it today, but in terms of osteoporosis, protein content, to be sure you get enough is important, probably more important than calcium. And it's usually not a problem. And finally, just to make the point again, that healthy choices for us will also help the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraser, for that very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Couple of questions, and you kind of summarized it there at the end, but you know, not too long ago, in fact, fairly recently, there have been studies back in October 2019, I think it was, in a paper reported in the Annals of Internal Medicine, suggesting that the use of red meat and processed red meats maybe wasn't so harmful for us after all. And then there was a kind of a backlash after that. Frank who from Harvard responded in disagreement. But even last week, I was reading an article, one of the Medscape articles that came through. You know, they always flash up these headlines. Is red meat really bad for you? And, you know, it was really a discussion between two gentlemen that were saying, well, since people enjoy their red meat so much, why don't we just make recommendations to, you know, limit red meats? And there was some suggestion of maybe 3, servings per week. And so I noticed that you mentioned that here in your study. So what are your thoughts when you hear these kinds of conversations in the para literature?
Well, thank you, Dan.
I mean, that is a good question, isn't it? Because there was such a lot of publicity about that one publication or one issue of the journal, actually, that had 3 or 4 articles that were highly controversial. In fact, it turned out that the meat industry was somewhat involved in promoting that, funding it. And if you look closely at some of the articles that they referenced, the claims they made for them were exactly the opposite of what those studies had showed. It was a very sad chapter, I think, in that journal's history, unfortunately. The evidence is, I think, pretty overwhelming, both with total mortality, with colorectal cancer, with diabetes, with obesity, that red meats are not the only bad thing in the diet, but that they're one of the things to be minimized, if not avoided altogether. I mean, I think it's kind of true that for some people to say that it suggests that you're going to become a vegetarian, particularly if you live down the southern states, is unlikely to succeed. And so to have some thoughts about minimization is probably useful, although if you look at our data, it's kind of interesting that what we have, our non-vegetarians, are those that are already kind of fairly minimal from the perspective of the general society, and we're finding that our vegetarians are doing yet better.
Thank you. Another question, do the studies show that UK vegetarians have the same improvement in outcomes as the US Adventists?
Yes, well, that's an excellent question and something that's engendered quite a bit of controversy. I spent a year at Cambridge University a while ago on a fellowship, and we've collaborated, in fact, continue to collaborate to this day with the group at Oxford. Oxford University has actually the other large study of vegetarians, not quite as large as ours, and so we've actually published together with them. And it turns out that the results, if you just look at the UK results, UK vegetarians, are a little different to ours. Both of our studies show pretty good differences in terms of cardiovascular disease, mainly mortality we've been able to look at in a comparative sense. Not a lot of difference there. We have many more vegans than they were able to identify. But when it comes to total mortality, we have stronger results. But, be aware that our vegetarians as a whole, in terms of total mortality, the differences are only kind of 10 to 12%. There's not huge advantages in total mortality. And for cancer mortality, our trends are kind of similar, but again, our data is stronger. And having lived in the UK for, a year, to obtain fruit and vegetables year-round with the variety that we enjoy here in most of the United States is a little different. And even their published data suggests that vegetarians in the UK don't actually have the same diet as vegetarians in the US. And of course, the definition of a vegetarian is pretty loose. I mean, what have you got? You've got meat consumption, the absence or minimization of it, and for vegans, there's emphasis on dairy and eggs. And that's about all we say. So we say nothing in the definitions about all the other components of the diet. So when you talk about vegetarians in different parts of the world, you need to be very careful to realize that you're not necessarily talking about actually the same diets. And we've also just recently published, we did a kind of a collaborative study with vegetarians in Asia, for instance, and not finding quite the same differences there, mainly in risk factors as yet, rather than disease events. But we can see that their diets, the vegetarians, are very, very different. And if you look at the vegetarians in India, for instance, They use a lot of ghee and dairy and stirred into all kinds of things, and they cook and cook and cook. So one needs to be rather careful, and that's why I think that our data now kind of putting processing into the equation and finding that that made a difference was quite exciting to us.
Thank you. Another question, have there been any studies that you're aware of that showed differences in gut microbiome between Adventists and non-Adventists?
We have not compared Adventists to non-Adventists. We've got unpublished work as yet, a manuscript that's nearly complete, that looked at our non-vegetarian Adventists and our vegetarian Adventists. And somewhat surprisingly, we could not clearly define much difference. There are other smaller studies out there that have looked at vegetarians and non-vegetarians in non-Adventist groups of people, that some of them have found some differences, but they've really been very small and very kind of focused on particular populations. So I think that's somewhat of an unanswered question, but in several hundred people in our data, at least, we didn't find big differences between the Adventist vegetarians and Adventist non-vegetarians.
Very good. Next is a two-part question. One is, do you have an opinion about the impact of vitamin D and omega-3 supplementation versus dietary sources of those things? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question from the same questioner is, are you yourself vegan or vegetarian or pesco-vegetarian? Put you on the spot.
Right. Well, that's okay. As far as the vitamin D and the omega-3, I don't think I've got a good basis to respond to that question in a definitive way. We're just about to look, I hope, at omega-3s in our diet. And of course, the omega-3s come in several different packages. The most common omega-3 is linolenic acid, which is not a very long chain omega fatty acid. And the Adventists actually, and particularly the vegetarians, do have high intakes of linolenic acid, the 18-3. But when you come to the EPA and the DHA and the DPA, the very long chain, 24, 25 carbons, our Adventists and the vegetarians tend to have relatively low intakes. And so it's unclear there just what's going on health-wise. And the whole question about fish and cardiovascular disease, which was almost thought to be settled a while ago, is now not so clear. Some of the more recent studies have not really shown that out too positively. So, the question is whether you take them as pills or whether you take them as foods, I think is an unsettled question. In general, I think our preference is foods. And vitamin D, of course, sun exposure is probably the preferred way to get it, moderate sun exposure, although we know that as you get older, your skin doesn't work so well. So to take some moderate supplementation is probably sensible, but there's a lot of work yet to be done on that. And the whole story with both of those things, I don't think is well understood.
Very good.
Oh, yeah, I didn't answer your question about what I do.
Oh, I thought you intentionally skipped over that.
No. It's just a senior moment. I suppose I'm not a vegan. I did not come into these questions of looking at dairy with any positive biases in that direction, I can tell you. And the findings with respect to dairy that we have come up with have been surprising, but not in any way troubling to me. It's very good information. I do believe I will have the occasional fish. I grew up in New Zealand, a maritime country, but I am vegetarian. So probably I'm a pesco vegetarian, low dairy. make sure I get enough calcium.
So thank you for full disclosure. And speaking of veganism. So yeah, that was fascinating to report the impact of that on breast cancer and prostate cancer. Very fascinating. And that kind of ties in with our last question here. So as veganism becomes more popular, there are a lot of vegan products on the market in restaurants. I can tell you I was at a vegan restaurant in Newport a few weeks ago that you really wouldn't kind of consider to generally be a very healthy product, but are there some deleterious effects of those types of vegan products compared to more of a whole food based diet, fresh fruits and vegetables?
Yeah, that's an important question, isn't it? And we have not yet taken the opportunity to look specifically at our meat substitute products. Having said that, remember that slide where we were looking at the impact of processed foods, and in the middle of it, we focused just on the vegetarians. And it turned out that if you look at that slide carefully, that it was clear that the vegetarians who preferred a lot of highly processed foods, which when you think about it, I guess could include cakes and vegetarian pies and so forth, but amongst Adventists, it will presumably include a lot of those meat analogs. Those people didn't do as well. So I can't definitively point the finger at those products as yet, and there's probably a wide variety of them and their different impacts. But I would say treat them with caution, not to rule them out necessarily, but to have a diet which focuses very, very heavily on highly processed foods, even if they come from good sources like soy and whole grains and nuts and so forth, may not be a good choice.
So, Dr. Fraser, thank you so much for your wisdom, your skill in collecting and interpreting this data. Very important data, and we so much appreciate your willingness to be with us here today and sharing with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Good.